Hello, how are you doing? It's a very chilly day here in London, so I thought I'd put on my cozy winter jumper and do another booktube tag video because I've been falling behind on these tag videos and been wanting to do some more. And this is a really interesting one because it's all about the subject of rereading. And so Jasmine kindly tagged me to do this on her booktube channel, so I'll put a link to her video below. And there are 10 questions all about the subject of rereading, so I'll go through them all and answer them, and I'd be really interested to know your answers on these as well if you want to put them in the comments below or do your own video if you have your own channel, and or just let me know about your thoughts about rereading in general and some of the best books you've reread over the course of time, because yeah, I think it's really interesting. As I've been getting older, I've been rereading more, and so yeah, but anyway, I'll get into all of that. So question one is, where do you sit on the rereading scale from almost never to all the time? And so yeah, traditionally I never reread all that much because, you know, there, like Jasmine talked about and I talked about with Anna in a recent video, there is so much to read, so many new books to read, that it's really difficult to convince myself to, oh, I should go back to this book and, you know, read it again. And even though I know there's so much I'm gonna get out of that rereading experience, but yeah, it's just that sort of mental hurdle of convincing myself to actually do that. Like I've been talking about, I've been wanting to reread the novel Girl, Woman, Other ever since I first read it over a year ago, but just haven't got around to it. So yeah, I am rereading more, and some very recently for a very specific reason. But yeah, I'll get into that. So question two is, has that changed over your reading life? And yeah, and like I said, it has been changing, you know, especially recently. And but it is still a difficulty, and there's still always books that I say I want to go back and reread, you know, especially ones from my teenage years that I read really early on, like 100 Years of Solitude and some novels of Dostoevsky, which I'm sure I didn't totally get or appreciate fully at the time, but, you know, that I was just sort of in awe of in my naive young person way, and that I would probably, you know, understand a bit better now. I'm sure I would still miss a lot of the references and, you know, things about them, but I'm sure I would get a lot more from reading them now. So yeah, it has been changing, but sort of very slowly. And then question three is, when do you reread? Maybe immediately after finishing a book, years later, or when the mood strikes you. And it is really different for different books. I mean, some books I'll go in and dip into and reread some of them over time, and then others, yeah, I'll you know, but usually it'll be over a long period of time. Like I said, how, you know, a book that I read in my teenage years and reread it now, and that'll give me such a different experience of it, and I know it will. But it can be really interesting if you reread a book immediately after having read it, because then you're not looking at the sort of plot and story so much, and it's more just about the characters and some of the nuance or maybe connections you didn't see or get on the first go around. So I think it's really interesting how that's, yeah, the sort of different experiences of it, and, you know, and how if you reread a book, you know, decades after having first read it, you'll probably have to refamiliarize yourself with, you know, the main story and a lot of the characters, because they'll, you know, faded into the background of your memory. But so yeah, it's really interesting, that experience. But I've found recently, since I've been a judge on the Costa Book Awards this year, I'm having to go back and reread some books that I immediately after reading them, and that's a really interesting experience, and, you know, giving me a different appreciation for the stories than when I first read them. So so yeah, I'm finding that process really interesting. So question four is, why do you reread books? And yeah, sort of for the reasons that I've been dipping into already. Sometimes it's wanting to revisit a story that I feel like I probably appreciated but didn't, you know, totally get on the first go around. And then there are other books, you know, like recently, that I'll reread because, you know, I, for this book prize, when I really need to get into the detail of it to discuss it with the other judges. And so yeah, I'm finding that so fascinating. But also sometimes I'll just reread a book because it's a favorite of mine, and I'll want to go back and sort of for almost the comfort of it, but also the sheer joy I just love this book so much that I know that I am going to appreciate it and enjoy it. And so I think it's kind of knowing that you'll love what you're going to read, whereas a lot of the times, obviously, if it's a new book, you may get a sense that this will probably be a book that I'll really appreciate and enjoy, but you never know until you actually get into it, because there are certainly some books I've read in the past several months that I assumed I would love and just really didn't get along with and just put aside after 50 pages or so. So I think it's really interesting, that whole process of rereading, and why reading is such a rich, varied, joyous experience, Question 5 is, how do you reread? Faster, slower, or just the best bits? And this is kind of interesting because, there are some books which I will, certainly with fiction, I think I won't often just go in and read the best bits, because that feels slightly traitorous to the construction of the fictional experience of going into a book. I sort of want the whole experience or nothing. But there are certainly novels, like my favorite novel of all time, The Waves by Virginia Woolf, which I've reread countless times. And so because I know the characters and the story so well, the 6 main characters in the story and how it goes through their life, I know it so well, I feel like I can dip into and appreciate different parts of it. And this is a really embarrassing confession to make, but often I'll reread sections of this in the middle of the night when I can't sleep, and will find myself getting so emotionally involved in it that I'll just sit there in bed with tears streaming down my eyes while reading it. And think about my poor partner who wakes up in the middle of the night and hears me like reading this and crying, and just sort of tapping me on the shoulder and being like, go back to sleep, you really need to get some more sleep. But I definitely find I can go into bits of this, but it's very unusual that with fiction I'll do that. But with nonfiction, I think it's a lot easier to sort of dip in and out of rereading something. So definitely, like with the journals of Joyce Carol Oates, I'll just dip into sections of this from different years. I go on a different date, especially with journals where you can go on a particular date. If it happens to be, October 15th of a particular year, you can go back to a previous year of like 20 or 30 years ago and see what that author was doing on that given day. And I think it's sort of fun and interesting to do that, but with this in particular, there's so many little insights she gives about the writing process and the reading process and the reading life in this, but also little tidbits, just beautiful descriptions of the weather that happened to be there on that particular day, or sort of literary encounters she has in her life, or issues to do with her publishers, or her state of being an author, that I think is so fascinating. So I've gone back to this, several times over the course of my life and reread sections of it. Definitely. So question 6 is, what do you reread more specifically? Which authors or genres or individual books? And I've talked about that sort of already, but there are probably only maybe 15 or 16 or 24 books that I've reread over the course of my life. It's really not that many. So I can't count all that many books that I've done this with before. So it is more likely to be, favorite authors that I'll go back and reread, or favorite books, like Joyce Carol Oates or Virginia Woolf. Question 7 is there a book that you found better when you reread it? And this is an example I often go back to when I talk about rereading, which is Julian Barnes' novel, The Sense of an Ending, which I first read shortly after it was first published, and really didn't make much of an impression on me. It just the story just sort of breezed over me, and I really didn't take it in. But then I reread this a few years ago when the new film of this book came out, and I made a whole video doing a comparison between the book and the film. But I also talked a lot about the rereading experience, because I appreciated this story so much the second go around, which really had to do, I think, with being a bit older and having more experience. And so I was able to connect with this story, which is so much about the process of memory. And I enjoyed and appreciated this novel so much more the second go around, and think it's an absolutely extraordinary book and is now like one of my favorites, because I think it is so brilliant and meaningful. But there are other people I know, like Anna James, who um, doesn't really like this novel all that much, when I talked to her about it before. So I'd be super interested if she went back and reread it, and if you've reread this novel, I'd be interested to know your thoughts about it. But also, yeah, other books that you've reread that you found you really appreciated on the second go around, whereas on the first go around it really didn't make much of an impression. So it really makes me think I should go back, and there are some novels that I just sort of dismissed or sort of like threw off the first go around, because so much about the reading experience is subjective, and I think it has to do a lot with, you know, where you are in your life and your mood, and, you know, what time of year it is even. So if you go back and reread something, that you can get so much more out of it the second go around, when you may have, you know, dismissed it for many years. And I think it's really interesting and fun, that whole process as well. So question 8 is, and one that was worse. A book that I reread, that I might have thought was worse the second go around, and one which I talked about recently, which I tried rereading a few years ago, and which didn't just stick with me as well, was To the Lighthouse. But I think this is has to do with my mood at the time, because when I first read this in my like early 20s or whenever it was, I really enjoyed it and appreciated it. But then, yeah, a few years ago, I tried to go back to this, and you would think, it being Virginia Woolf, one of my favorite authors, I'd absolutely love it. And obviously, this is probably her most famous novel. So, but yeah, it just it felt sort of like plodding and not, you know, it didn't really flow for me in the same way. But then, if I think about it on the outside, I there's so much about this novel which I think is so meaningful and emotional, because I know it was so personal to Woolf when she wrote it. It's so much about her family life and the loss of her mother, and so this depiction of the loss of a matriarchal figure who is so central to this family's life is, you know, incredibly moving, and it's really profound how she explores that. But then, yeah, in the individual stories of how she was writing it, I just was finding it sort of it's really interesting sometimes when there's books which when you think about them outside of the reading experience, they can be so meaningful to you, but then when you are reading the actual text of it, it can, you know, not chime as well. So I think that's more about how the idea of a book can be more, you know, profound than the actual experience of it. I think it's really interesting, that whole process. I definitely found that as well with the novel Reservoir 13 by John McGregor. I think that's the title and the author name, which as I was actually reading it, I found it a bit hard going through it, and I just didn't really see the point of it. But then when I finally finished it and I was thinking back on it and all the themes on it and the subject matter of it, it felt so amazing and incredible. Like really, yeah, like just sort of, and I don't think it's just me intellectualizing it or, you know, trying to say like, oh, this novel is greater than the actual experience. It's just really like, it's, yeah, so interesting how there are certain books where, yeah, just the I guess the resounding experience of it over time is more meaningful than the actual, yeah, physical experience of reading it. Yeah, that's so interesting, isn't it? How that goes sometimes. So then question 9 is, which one book have you reread the most times? And for me, I mean, that would definitely have to be The Waves by Virginia Woolf, which I have just read countless times or reread sections of it countless times. And, you know, quite often I'll just randomly go to a section and start rereading through a different character's voice, you know, a certain section of it. And it's so incredible and so beautifully poetic. But also, I think because it is so poetic, a lot of people sort of dismiss it or don't quite get the novel at first when reading it, because it all kinds of blends together. But there are 6 distinct characters in this novel, actually 7 characters, but you get the voices or the subconscious speech of 6 different characters, and to give a perspective from their childhood to very late in their life. And so it's especially a great novel to reread over the course of your life, because as you age and you have different experiences, you appreciate different parts of the story in different ways. And so yeah, I highly always highly recommend this novel. But yeah, especially for that reason, if you're looking to look at varied and different life experiences from different perspectives in different times of your life, it's definitely good for that. And so, yeah, and then finally, question 10 is tag somebody. And I'm not going to tag anybody in particular. I just say if you're interested in this subject and want to answer these questions, please do make a video or answer the questions in the comments below this video. And yeah, I'll be really interested to hear your responses to them as well. So thank you for watching and listening to me blab on about all the experience of rereading. And I'll speak to you again soon. Bye, everyone.